Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out today. It is my pleasure to talk to you a little bit about music as medicine today, which is an integral part of our vision at the Center for Music and Medicine. But before I begin, I would like to start by acknowledging my key partners at our Center for Music and Medicine. So first, our co-founder, Dr. Saurabh Bashtepi-Gray, if you could please stand up. And Dr. Sarah Hoover, he's our Music and Medicine Center co-director. So with that in mind, I want to give a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. I want to ask the big question: whence and why music? Where did it come from? Can we perhaps make some conjectures about where it's coming from? I will tell you a little bit about the mechanistic research that's been done in recent decades with the new tools that we have available to study these questions. We'll tell you about my own work, and then we'll conclude about and speak about the current and future directions at our center. So the question of whence music? Is it nature or nurture? Is it something that's hardwired in our brains from the time we were born or even earlier? Or is the influence of our environment as we grow up the bigger determinant for what type of music we enjoy and whether we will end up being excellent musicians? Well, when we're talking about origins of music, I think it's likely we could agree that it probably stems from naturally occurring sounds and rhythms. Shamanistic beliefs across cultures involve music, drumming, for example, as a key part of the rituals. People getting into a trance and feeling together. The call and response system in monkeys, something that has been studied by Dr. Xiaoqing Wang at Johns Hopkins for quite some time, as well as many species of birds and other animals, involve rhythm and music. Darwin himself actually suggested that music and dance, which are very costly energetically, if you're thinking about the decision of going to hunt for food for your family versus staying put and singing or dancing, perhaps may enhance somebody's ability to attract mates, if somebody is able to do that well. I really am fascinated by the research that's been done on motherese, the language between babies and their mothers, which is remarkably conserved across cultures when it comes to the inflections, the pitch variation in language, whether we're talking about a tonal language like Chinese or English, a very different language. We also know that babies can hear up to 20 weeks before birth. So perhaps the exposure begins well before we see the world. I have to mention a caveat that not everybody is so convinced that the music and rhythm are important to study. The evolutionary biologist from Harvard, Dr. Steven Pinker, has called music auditory cheesecake in his writings. He thinks that music may be an incidental evolutionary byproduct in the development of language. Well, I'm standing in front of you here today, and I'm biased, but I beg to differ. So now, I want to give you a bit of an anatomy lesson. We are looking at the underside of the brain on the right side. You have the front up top, the back at the bottom of the screen, and left and right are where they should be. And the area called the temporal plane, in Latin, the planum temporale, is the wedge-shaped area inside the area for language understanding and processing, which is called the Wernicke's area of the brain. So the area for processing pitch is embedded inside the part of the brain that is meant to understand language. So it's clear that there is a lot of overlap, but it's separable. These are not exactly the same. The other thing that really is meant to jump out of the on the prior slide is just how much bigger that area is on the left side of the brain and on the right, up to 10 times larger, in fact. And this is not a coincidence. This is most likely linked to the fact that 9 out of 10 people in this room process language, both understand it and produce it, on the left side of the brain. So I'll come back to why that's important later. Why do we listen to music? What is it that motivates us? Well, there is actually a pleasure response that is now measurable with current tools. My colleagues, 16 years ago, published an important paper that shows that brain activity in specific regions that are involved in the processing of positive emotion and reward are activated by hearing music. Moreover, another set of researchers demonstrated that there is dopamine release in the brain during the time people anticipate hearing music that they're going to like and during the actual peak emotional experience in response to music. Well, question is, why is this important? Well, dopamine is what's missing in the brain of patients with Parkinson's disease. And so perhaps that is a way to activate more dopamine. The other thing that's very important to know is that no two people in this room will have exactly the same MRI activation pattern when they're listening to even the same piece of music. So that suggests that while music perhaps has something in it for everyone, the approach to different patients will need to be tailored, personalized. So that's the connection to the idea of personalized medicine, which has been on people's minds quite a bit lately. We also know that what I just mentioned was short-term effects of music. In the long term, there are significant changes in the brains of people who get involved with music. In fact, as little as 16 months of musical training on an instrument or singing can change somebody's brains. So I apologize, I don't have my pointer, but I just want to mention that in a 2-year period of naturally developing 8-year-old, going from 8 years old to 10 years old, the arcuate fasciculus, the area connecting the parts in the brain that understand language and produce language, grows. That area grows at a significantly more rapid rate with musical training in somebody who is age and gender matched. Also, at the bottom, you could see that there's hope for those over the age of 60. If you compare the 63-year-old musician on the left-hand panel to the 63-year-old non-musician, his arcuate fasciculus, again, the left side being much larger, has grown to a much more significant extent. Also not shown here is the main white matter highway connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, called the corpus callosum, which is significantly bigger when controlling for age and gender in those who are engaged with music. So, what about rhythm? Well, I think rhythm is very important as well. And when trying to discriminate between different rhythms, kids, adult non-musicians, and adult musicians very clearly have different activation patterns. It doesn't take a scientist to realize that. In general, as we grow, more areas of the brain tend to be affected when we're trying to perceive rhythm. But in musicians, there's a clear additional pattern of activation in the frontal lobe, the areas of the brain that are involved with analytical processing. So perhaps the musicians are trained to think more about music as a language, if you will. So now I'd like to really focus on some of the work that I've been doing, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page as I start to give you a background on Parkinson's disease. I've already mentioned that Parkinson's disease involves the loss of brain cells that make dopamine, this pleasure chemical that I mentioned. Well, it also is the neurotransmitter, the messenger molecule that helps us move. So Parkinson's disease is a major societal issue in the United States and in the world. It's the second most common neurodegenerative disease after Alzheimer's disease. And what I teach my medical students is a mnemonic that I will share with you called TRAP, people trapped by Parkinson's disease. T for shaking, that's tremor. R for rigidity, that's muscle stiffness as opposed to the joint stiffness of arthritis. A for akinesia or bradykinesia, that's just the medical term for slowness and loss of coordination of fine movements, so the fingers and toes. And then I highlight at the bottom P for postural instability. That's the walking difficulty and loss of balance that tend to occur as Parkinson's disease progresses and often are the most debilitating symptoms of the disease. So Dr. Hallett at the National Institutes of Health and a number of other researchers in the last decade have demonstrated clearly that patients with Parkinson's disease need to activate more of their brain in order to perform the same activity as we do. So, for example, walking, which becomes difficult, is not something we normally think about. It's automatic. That automatic pattern breaks down, and more areas in the brain of Parkinson's disease patients need to be activated in order to accomplish the same task. We also know that physical therapy can improve movement, walking particularly, and balance in patients with Parkinson's disease in the short term. But the problem is, how do we motivate people, how do we motivate patients to continue doing the exercise? Because we know from research studies that within 4 to 6 weeks of stopping the intervention of physical therapy, people go back to their baseline. In other words, if you don't use it, you lose it. So we also need to learn about what type of physical therapy and exercise needs to be done. So that leads to the question. I've told you a little bit about rhythm. May rhythm help Parkinson's disease? We clearly know that people with Parkinson's disease lose their rhythm, so to speak. Can we give it back to them in some way? Well, it's been shown in other diseases that therapeutic music performance, actually playing an instrument, may improve some movement, some motor skills. And the concept behind it is rhythmic entrainment. What is that? Well, rhythmic entrainment, to put it simply, is our body's patterning internally as a result of rhythms that we hear or feel from the outside. So this kind of resonance, internal resonance, rhythmic entrainment. And the way that this may potentially work, and where a lot more work needs to be done, is either by getting around the pathways in the brain that are impaired in Parkinson's disease or stroke, for example, or augmenting, increasing the amount of activation in the pathways that perhaps are lying dormant as a result of disease. This I just wanted to show. It's a little bit busy, especially in the back, but there is actually some evidence that shows we have this resonance in the brain when we're hearing particular rhythms. So these are healthy participants on the top that are listening to rhythms of increasing speed. These are hertz, so cycles per second, from 1.25 to 2.5 to 5 hertz. And below is a recording of their brain waves according to electroencephalography, EEG, so surface electrodes. And we see very clearly that there are peaks in the pattern of the frequency spectrum or pattern of the EEG that correspond to the frequency that they're hearing. But even more interestingly, as the speed increases, and you might say somebody is just clapping along, so it's a feedback from this sensory impact of just tapping to a beat that you're hearing. People stop tapping usually around 5 hertz. It just gets to be really fast if you try to clap 5 times a second or more. But the brain continues to have these internal peaks as you're continuing to get faster and faster. So the idea is perhaps there is this built-in capacity for rhythmic entrainment in the brain. A lot more research needs to be done. So the question then is, how can we harness rhythmic entrainment in a way that is pleasant and motivating for people to continue this? Well, how about drumming? I mentioned it's long been part of traditional research, rituals worldwide in multiple cultures. And when I was in training shortly before I came to Hopkins, we had a group of patients at a retreat with Parkinson's disease who did 45 minutes of West African drumming. Each had their own drum, and they had an instructor. They came up to us afterwards and said, we feel there's overall a greater sense of well-being. Some people said, my medications seem to be working better. And some people actually said, my walking and balance seem to improve. So that led me to ask the question, how can we study this in a more systematic way? So this is just a picture of our design. This is a pilot study, so the numbers are small. That's important to know. And at the beginning, we had 10 drummers with Parkinson's disease and 10 well-matched controls with Parkinson's disease who did not end up participating in the drumming. So equal numbers of women, same disease stage, Parkinson's disease. And for 6 weeks, we had twice a week drumming for the drumming group, so 12 total sessions. And the controls had their usual care. So we assessed everybody at the beginning of the study, 6 weeks later, and then another 6 weeks after the drumming was over. Just showing you one key result point. We used, among other things, a standard validated questionnaire of Parkinson's disease specific quality of life called the PDQ-39. And after 6 weeks of drumming, our drummers had a significant, statistically significant and clinically significant improvement in quality of life, which then, here's the other important point, went back to being nearly at the same level as the beginning of the study once they stopped drumming for 6 weeks. Again, as with therapy, if you don't use it, you lose it. No such differences were seen among controls. There are a number of participant reflections. People overall, those that were in the drumming study, enjoyed it very much. But one thing that I just want to highlight, which I think is really important, important part of what we're trying to do, somebody said, one of the participants said, it was a welcome challenge to get up, get dressed and out of the house in the morning. I took 2 buses and enjoyed being amongst those who had a purpose. For those of you whose lives have been touched with Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or similar aging-related diseases, you know how isolating the disease can be for the patients and for their care partners and families. Something like this can perhaps help us break this down. So to run through the conclusions, 6 weeks of twice-a-week West African drum circle classes significantly improved self-reported quality of life in our patients with Parkinson's disease. This improvement went away after 6 weeks. The people were not drumming, which shows that we need to continue this. And we did assess using a smartphone application that hooked onto a belt both walking and balance parameters. And so the study was very small to find significant differences. But interestingly, we found that there was a trend from the beginning of the study to the end in those who drummed to walk a bit faster. The mood also, the self-reported mood questionnaire, improved to an extent, so that's something we plan to follow up. Well, I think you might agree at this point that our findings show the importance of pursuing non-traditional therapeutic interventions that, by the way, I think you'd agree lack side effects in Parkinson's disease. And we clearly need larger, well-controlled studies comparing the drumming classes to established treatments like physical therapy. To switch gears, I want to tell you a little bit about another study that we did called Parkinsonics. We know that the voice is clearly impaired in Parkinson's disease, and for many people, it really makes communication with loved ones and friends difficult. So it's a major problem as the disease progresses. We also know from other studies that therapeutic singing can help one focus on deeper breathing to counteract that fading voice that happens over time, and improve the monotone speech, improve understandability. With practice, it may even help people to initiate speech, which may actually be a problem with Parkinson's disease as well. This has been most clearly demonstrated in patients with strokes using melodic intonation therapy, which we don't have time to talk about today. So our study here at Hopkins was called Parkinsonics. We started with 32 participants, and we randomly assigned half of them to start singing with a professional instructor once a week. And they did this for 12 weeks. At the same time, the other half of the participants were assigned to meet weekly in the same space as the singers, but a separate room, in a support group. So that's an important behavioral control that we use because that got people out of the house, breaking down the isolation. And we wanted to see what, if any, improvements were due to the singing itself, specifically voice-related improvements, which we measured objectively at the same distance by recording people and using a decibel meter, a sound pressure level meter. So we did assessments every 6 weeks for 30 weeks. Everybody did the singing, everybody did the support groups, everything, the interventions are over by 24 weeks. Then we reassessed 6 weeks later to see if any benefits went away. So here are our results. Firstly, this was feasible. 26 out of 32 participants stayed with us for over half a year. So that's important. There was a significant improvement if we looked at the entire group of participants, because remember, everybody sang and everybody did the support group. There was significant improvement from beginning to the end of the study in the average loudness when people described a picture that they saw for 30 seconds, kind of a real-life speech sample, and also a significant improvement in decibels and loudness when they read a standard passage called the Rainbow Passage. What's interesting is that these improvements were actually sustained 6 weeks after the study was over. One thing that we were pleasantly surprised about, we looked at the movement outcomes as well. That seemed to improve as well. Perhaps you might have a clue as to why that may be happening. If you remember at the beginning, the video that was shown, people do a lot of kind of physical movements as part of the singing class. The quality of life improvements, we can now say, specifically with communication and the body comfort, which are subscales of our Parkinson's disease questionnaire, they improved and were clearly attributable to the singing, as opposed to meeting the support group. So what's next for us? Well, even before the study was over, most of the participants came up to us and said, we really like it, we want to continue. So we felt we absolutely must transition this into a community-based group. So we've done that. The Parkinsonics group, with a capital S in the middle, continues on a weekly basis in the same location where the study was held, under the same leadership. We've opened it up to other Parkinsonian disorders, and it's co-funded by the Hopkins Parkinson's Disease and Movement Disorder Center in association with a community-based group called the Maryland Association for Parkinson's Support. We're planning follow-up assessments for voice, volume, movement function, and quality of life as well. What are some of the other current directions that we're pursuing at the Center for Music and Medicine? Well, we're in the process of almost, I will say, finishing recruitment of dyads, pairs of patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease and their carers, their care partners, for a side-by-side singing study to see if we can improve various aspects of quality of life in this horrible disease. We're also just about ready to start a pilot study with the clear participation from Peabody of guitar lessons to improve hand dexterity in Parkinson's disease. Recall, as I mentioned, that's a major impairment as well. And that's called Guitar PD. And we're also interested in partnering with others, and engineers particularly, on application-based, smartphone application-based systems to improve auditory cues for Parkinson's disease and other diseases. What are some of the things on the horizon that we'd love to move forward as rapidly as we can? We are studying currently in my clinic at the Bayview Medical Center the effects of rhythmic auditory cues on walking in atypical Parkinsonian disorders, the cousins of Parkinson's disease that don't have good treatments and progress much more rapidly. We are in the process of planning for next year a larger controlled parallel group study of drumming for both Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. And we have been in discussions with a nearby facility to do a controlled study of a single personally meaningful song to improve behavior and emotional processing in patients with Alzheimer's dementia and non-Alzheimer's dementia. We're also working to partner with the Johns Hopkins Brain Science Institute to put together a yearly symposium on neuroaesthetics and other collaborations. So I would be remiss not to mention that just this year, others have been hearing everything that's been going on with music as medicine. Specifically, you see the guitarist here, that's Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, who has come together, it all started apparently at a dinner party, with Renee Fleming, the amazing soprano, and they launched this amazing partnership, the Sound Health Partnership, between the NIH and the Kennedy Center to move forward, hopefully, toward the funding of this kind of music and rhythm-based research. So with that in mind, I want to keep my promise and come back to the initial question I asked. Whence music? Where does music come from? Well, none of the theories that I've put forth so far when it comes to the evolutionary question can be proven conclusively. But I think we can all agree that for us, music serves a number of important social functions. And music may indeed be used as medicine.